Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Facts channel. Tonight we are traveling back to one of the darkest and most transformative chapters in all of human history, the Black Death. The plague that swept across the known world in the 14th century and killed more people in less time than any other event before or since. It arrived without warning from the east, and within a few years had reached from China to Iceland, from the deserts of Central Asia to the fishing villages of Norway, leaving behind a silence so vast and so complete that the people who survived it struggled to find words for what they had witnessed. But this is not simply a story of death. It is also a story of how human beings respond when the world as they know it stops making sense, how they explain the inexplicable, how they care for each other and abandon each other and find each other again on the other side of catastrophe, how a civilization that loses a third of its people in a handful of years begins, eventually, to rebuild itself, and in rebuilding, discovers that some of what was lost does not need to be replaced. The Black Death reshaped medicine, religion, art, economics, language, and politics. It ended feudalism in much of Europe. It gave power to the people who survived it. It inspired some of the most extraordinary art ever made, and some of the most disturbing. It sent people into churches, and out of them. It made fortunes and destroyed dynasties. It is, in the fullest sense, the event that made the modern world. If these quiet journeys through history bring you some peace tonight, I would love it if you liked, or subscribed, or left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is settle in. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. And as the night gathers around you, come with me into the 14th century, into the world before the plague and through it, and out the other side. Let us begin. The world before the Black Death arrived was already under enormous strain. It is easy to imagine medieval Europe before the plague as a stable and settled place, a world of stone castles and village churches and peasants tilling their fields in a rhythm that had continued unchanged for centuries. The reality was more troubled than that picture suggests. In the decades immediately before the Black Death arrived, Europe had already been weakened by a series of catastrophes that had eroded the resilience of its population. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had killed millions across northern Europe. A period of unusually cold and wet weather had destroyed harvests for years in succession. Grain stores ran out. Livestock died. People ate cats and dogs, and in some extreme cases resorted to things that contemporaries recorded with horror and would not describe in detail. The populations of many regions never fully recovered from the famine before the plague arrived to complete the work the hunger had begun. The political situation in Europe was equally unstable. England and France were engaged in the opening phases of what would become the 100 Years' War, a conflict that would drain both kingdoms for generations. The papacy had moved from Rome to Avignon in France, in a crisis of church authority that had shaken the spiritual confidence of Latin Christendom. The Italian city-states were in constant conflict with each other and with the Holy Roman Emperor. The Byzantine Empire was shrinking under pressure from the Ottoman Turks to the east. Into this already strained world, the plague arrived like a sentence being passed on a civilization that had already been found wanting. That is not how we should understand it. The plague was not a judgment, it was a bacterium. But the people who experienced it had no way of knowing that, and the frameworks through which they tried to understand what was happening to them shaped their response in ways that made the catastrophe both worse and eventually more survivable. The plague that caused the Black Death was a bacterium carried by fleas living on rats. For most of recorded history, people did not know what caused the plague. They knew it killed. They knew it spread. They knew it arrived in some places and not others. And they knew that once it arrived, it was almost impossible to stop. But the actual mechanism, the bacterium, the flea, the rat, was not identified until the 19th century, when Alexandre Yersin, a Swiss-French bacteriologist working in Hong Kong in 1894, identified the bacillus responsible during an outbreak of plague in that city. The bacterium that bears his name, Yersinia pestis, lives primarily in the bodies of rodents, particularly the black rat, which in the medieval period lived in close proximity to human beings in the grain stores, ships, houses, and streets of every inhabited place. The flea that lives on these rats feeds on the rat's blood, and in doing so, ingests the bacterium. When the rat dies, the flea must find a new host. In the absence of rats, it will bite a human being. In doing so, it regurgitates the bacterium into the bite wound, and the infection begins. This is the mechanism that the 14th century did not know about, and could not have prevented even if it had. The rats were everywhere. The fleas were everywhere. The conditions that allowed the bacterium to spread from animal to human and human to human were built into the fabric of medieval life in ways that no individual action could have altered. There are 3 forms of plague caused by this bacterium. Bubonic plague, the most common form, infects the lymphatic system and causes the swollen lymph nodes called buboes that give the disease its name. Septicemic plague infects the bloodstream directly and kills so quickly that the victim sometimes dies before the buboes even form. Pneumonic plague infects the lungs and can be spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, making it the most contagious and in many ways the most terrifying form. All 3 forms were present during the Black Death, and the pneumonic form in particular helps explain how rapidly the disease spread through densely populated areas where the flea and rat transmission chain alone could not fully account for the speed. The plague began in Central Asia and followed the trade routes west. The earliest reliable evidence of the Black Death places its origin in the region around Lake Issyk-Kul, in what is now Kyrgyzstan, where tombstone inscriptions from 1346 and 1347 record an unusual number of deaths attributed to plague. From there, it followed the network of trade routes that connected Central Asia to China in one direction and to the Black Sea ports of Crimea in the other. The Silk Road that had for centuries carried silk, spices, and ideas across the breadth of the Eurasian continent now carried something far more terrible in the bodies of infected rats sheltering in the goods carried by the caravans. The plague reached the Crimean port of Kaffa, modern Feodosia, around 1346. Kaffa was a Genoese trading colony on the northern shore of the Black Sea, and it was there that one of the most famous episodes in the history of biological warfare occurred. The Mongol army of the Golden Horde, besieging Kaffa, began dying of plague in large numbers. Their commander, according to the account of the Italian notary Gabriele de Mussi, ordered the bodies of the dead to be loaded onto catapults and hurled over the walls of the city. The defenders threw the bodies into the sea as fast as they could, but it was too late. The plague was already inside the walls. The Genoese merchants of Kaffa fled by ship across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean, carrying the plague with them. Whether the catapulted bodies were actually the mechanism of infection, or whether infected rats on the ships were the primary vector, is debated by historians. What is not debated is the outcome. The ships that left Kaffa in 1347 carried death to every port they touched. The plague arrived in Sicily in October of 1347 and spread with devastating speed. 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily, carrying sailors who were dying or already dead of a disease that produced terrifying symptoms in the bodies of those it struck. The Sicilian authorities ordered the ships out of the harbour immediately, but it was too late. The plague was already ashore. From Messina it spread across Sicily and then to the Italian mainland with a speed that left contemporaries struggling to describe what they were seeing. The Florentine chronicler Giovanni Vianney was writing a history of Florence when the plague arrived. He died of it before he could finish. His brother continued the chronicle and recorded what happened to the city. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague, described the city in his famous introduction to the Decameron in terms that remain some of the most vivid first-hand accounts of epidemic disease ever written. He described neighbors refusing to help neighbors, brothers abandoning brothers, parents leaving children, children abandoning parents to die alone. He described the bodies piling up in the streets because there were not enough living people to bury the dead. He described the grave diggers demanding enormous sums to perform work that killed them as they performed it. He described the pits dug outside city walls into which bodies were thrown in layers like goods being stowed in a ship, covered with a little earth, then more bodies on top, then more earth, until the pit was full and a new one had to be dug. Florence lost between half and 2/3 of its population within months. The numbers are so large that they remain difficult to fully absorb. A city of 100,000 people reduced to 40,000 in the space of a summer. Streets that had been crowded and noisy falling silent. Houses standing empty with everything inside them, as if the occupants had simply stepped out and never returned, which in many cases is exactly what had happened. The symptoms of bubonic plague were unmistakable and terrifying to witness. The first sign was often a sudden fever accompanied by chills and exhaustion so overwhelming that the victim could barely stand. Then came the buboes. The lymph nodes in the groin, the armpit, or the neck swelled to the size of an egg or an apple, hot and hard and exquisitely painful to the touch. The skin around the buboes might turn black, giving the disease one of the names by which it came to be known. The black patches spreading across the skin as the infection progressed gave medieval observers the image that would eventually produce the name Black Death, though that specific term was not widely used until the 16th century. Contemporary accounts more often called it simply the pestilence, the great mortality, or the great dying. After the buboes appeared, the victim might also develop dark spots on the skin caused by bleeding beneath the surface, called in medieval sources the tokens or the plague spots. The appearance of these spots was widely understood as a death sentence. Very few people who showed the full range of symptoms survived. In untreated bubonic plague, the mortality rate was between 30 and 60%. In septicemic plague, it approached 100%. In pneumonic plague, without modern antibiotics, mortality was essentially total. The medieval physician had nothing that worked against any of these forms. They could lance the buboes, which sometimes provided temporary relief and may in some cases have allowed the body's immune system to overcome the infection. They could apply poultices of herbs and other substances to the skin. They could recommend regimens of diet and rest. They could pray. None of it made a meaningful difference to the outcome. The disease progressed according to its own biology, entirely indifferent to everything the 14th century could bring against it. Medieval medicine had no framework for understanding what was happening to the world. The dominant medical theory of the medieval period was derived from the ancient Greeks, particularly from Galen, the 2nd century physician, whose work had been preserved and transmitted to medieval Europe through Arabic translations and commentaries. According to this framework, the human body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance determined health and whose imbalance caused disease. Treatment therefore aimed at restoring the humoral balance through bloodletting, purging, dietary adjustment, and the application of various substances to cool or heat or moisten or dry the body as required. This framework had nothing to say about bacterial infection because the concept of bacterial infection did not exist. The idea that a living microscopic organism could enter the body and multiply there and cause disease was entirely outside the conceptual world of the medieval physician. When the medical faculty of the University of Paris was asked by King Philip VI of France to explain the cause of the plague, they produced a formal report in 1348 that attributed the epidemic to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, which had caused a corruption of the air that poisoned the atmosphere, and with it the bodies of those who breathed it. The theory of miasma, the idea that disease was caused by corrupted or bad air, was the most widely accepted explanation for epidemic disease in the medieval period, and it shaped the response to the plague in both helpful and harmful ways. Helpful, because it led people to avoid crowded airless spaces where the air was considered most likely to be corrupted, which did reduce transmission in some circumstances. Harmful, because it led people to burn aromatic herbs and carry nosegays of flowers in the belief that sweet-smelling air was healthy air, which did nothing at all to address the actual mechanism of the disease. Physicians wore beaked masks stuffed with aromatic herbs when attending plague patients, believing the herbs would filter the corrupted air. The image of the plague doctor in his long black coat, wide-brimmed hat, and long beaked mask like a monstrous bird is one of the most recognizable images of the epidemic, and one that captures something true about the helplessness of 14th century medicine in the face of a disease it could not explain, could not treat, and could not stop. The plague spread through Europe with terrible speed between 1347 and 1350. From Sicily and the Italian ports, the plague moved north and west along the trade routes that connected the cities of medieval Europe. It reached Marseille in France by January 1348. It reached Paris by June. By August, it was in England, arriving at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset on a ship from Normandy. It reached Scotland by 1350. It reached Norway by the same year, carried on a ship that arrived in Bergen, with most of its crew already dead. The ship docked, and no one came ashore. Eventually the townspeople boarded the vessel and found the dead sailors and the plague rats and the infection that would soon spread through their own city. The story of the ghost ship arriving in Bergen with its cargo of death is one of the most haunting images of the entire epidemic. A vessel that had set out from one place and arrived at another, transformed in the crossing from a trading ship into a charnel house. The speed of the spread was partly a function of the trade routes and partly a function of the pneumonic form of the disease, which could move from person to person without any rat or flea intermediary. A sick merchant traveling between cities could infect the people he met along the road. A bundle of cloth packed in a warehouse where infected rats had been living could carry the disease to the weaver who unpacked it weeks later. The medieval world was more connected than people sometimes imagine, and that connectedness turned the plague from a regional epidemic into a continental catastrophe. Remote villages that had little contact with the outside world were sometimes spared or suffered later and less severely. But the towns and cities and ports and trading posts that formed the arteries of medieval commerce were almost universally struck, and struck hard. The plague followed the money, as diseases often do, because the money followed the movement of people and goods, and the movement of people and goods was what carried the infection. The death toll of the Black Death was staggering and has never been precisely calculated. Modern historians estimate that the Black Death killed between 75 million and 200 million people worldwide between 1346 and 1353. In Europe alone, the most widely accepted estimates suggest that between a third and a half of the entire population died. Some regions lost far more than that. Some cities lost 2/3 of their population. Some villages were entirely depopulated, their names surviving only in later documents that record them as deserted settlements. In England alone, between 1.5 and 2 million people died out of a pre-plague population of approximately 4 to 5 million. The clergy died in disproportionate numbers because priests and friars were required by their vocation to be present with the sick, and dying in ways that exposed them to the disease far more than the general population. In some English dioceses, more than half the parish clergy died. The monks and friars who ran the hospitals and infirmaries died alongside their patients. The judges and lawyers who kept the courts running died, and the courts stopped running. The administrators who collected taxes and managed estates died, and the records they kept became incomplete and fragmentary. The sheer scale of the mortality created practical problems that medieval society had no existing mechanisms to address. What do you do when there is no one left to bury the dead? What do you do when there is no one left to harvest the grain? What do you do when the priest is dead and there is no one to hear confession and give last rites to the dying? What do you do when the judge is dead and the courts are closed and there is no mechanism left for resolving disputes about property and inheritance? These were not abstract questions. They were the daily practical reality of life in Europe during and immediately after the plague years. The answers that communities found to these questions shaped the institutions that emerged from the epidemic, and in many cases, those new institutions were better than the ones the plague had destroyed. People explained the plague in the only frameworks available to them. In a world where the bacterium was unknown and unknowable, and where the dominant intellectual framework was Christian theology, the most natural explanation for a catastrophe of this scale was divine punishment. God was angry. God had sent the plague as a judgment on human sinfulness. This explanation was both comforting in its way, because it meant the catastrophe had a cause and a purpose, and deeply troubling, because it implied that the people dying had somehow deserved their fate. Pope Clement VI, who survived the plague at Avignon, partly by following the advice of his physician Guy de Chauliac, who recommended that he sit between two large fires to purify the air around him, issued a papal bull in 1348, acknowledging that the plague was a divine visitation, but also condemning the persecution of Jews that had broken out across Europe in the plague. Years. The persecution of Jews during the Black Death was one of the most terrible consequences of the epidemic. Jewish communities were accused of causing the plague by poisoning the wells from which Christian communities drew their water. The accusation was groundless. Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as their Christian neighbors, but the accusation spread from town to town, and in many places entire Jewish communities were massacred before the plague had even arrived. In Strasbourg in 1349, Approximately 2,000 Jews were burned alive on a platform in the city's Jewish cemetery by a mob convinced that they were responsible for the plague. The Pope condemned these massacres and pointed out that the plague was killing people in regions where there were no Jews at all, which should have been sufficient to refute the accusation. It was not sufficient. The massacres continued. The willingness to find a human explanation for a natural catastrophe, to identify a group, to blame, and to punish, is one of the darkest recurring patterns in human history, and the plague years revealed it with terrible clarity. The flagellants were one of the most dramatic religious responses to the suffering. If the plague was divine punishment for human sin, then the obvious response was to demonstrate to God that you understood the nature of your offense and were prepared to suffer for it. The flagellant movement expanded dramatically in the plague years into a mass religious phenomenon that spread across Germany and the Low Countries and into France. Companies of men, sometimes hundreds strong, would travel from town to town, performing public rituals of self-flagellation, beating themselves with leather straps embedded with metal tips until the blood ran, chanting hymns and prayers, attracting enormous crowds of observers, some of whom joined the procession, and some of whom simply watched. The performances were intensely theatrical and intensely emotional. They expressed in physical form the collective guilt and terror of a population that did not know why it was dying and could find no other way to respond to the incomprehensible. The flagellants began claiming that their self-inflicted suffering absolved them of sin without the need for confession to a priest or the other sacramental mechanisms of the institutional church. They began preaching to the crowds that gathered to watch them without church authorization. They began attacking clergy and expressing contempt for the institutional church in ways that looked dangerously close to heresy. Pope Clement VI condemned the movement in 1349 and ordered it suppressed. The flagellants did not disappear immediately, but the condemnation was effective enough that the movement lost its momentum within a year or two. What remained was the memory of thousands of bleeding men walking through plague-struck cities singing about sin and judgment, while the bodies of the dead were carted through the same streets to the mass graves outside the walls. The plague transformed the relationship between the living and the dead forever. Death in the medieval period was a social and religious event embedded in a complex set of rituals and practices designed to ease the transition of the soul from this world to the next, and to mark the passing of the individual within their community. A good death required time. It required the presence of family and friends at the deathbed. It required confession to a priest and the administration of last rites. It required a period of mourning and the performance of funeral rites that gave the community a formal opportunity to acknowledge the loss and pray for the soul of the deceased. It required burial in consecrated ground where the community could continue to pray. The plague destroyed all of this. The dying died too fast and too numerously for individual deathbed rituals. There were not enough priests to administer last rites to everyone who needed them. There was not enough consecrated ground to bury everyone who died. There was not enough time, and there were not enough surviving family members to perform the mourning rituals that gave death its social meaning. People died alone, without last rites, in unmarked mass graves, without mourning, without prayers, without the community acknowledgement that their life had mattered, and their death was a loss. The psychological impact of this stripping away of the rituals of death was profound and long-lasting. The dance of death, the dance macabre, in which skeletal figures of death lead people of every rank and station in a dance toward the grave, emerged as one of the dominant artistic motifs of the later 14th and 15th centuries. Death had become democratic. It took the Pope and the peasant with equal indifference. The plague had made that truth visible in a way that no previous generation had experienced so directly. The plague did not end in 1350. It kept returning for centuries. The initial outbreak of the Black Death between 1347 and 1353 was the most devastating, but it was not the last. Plague returned to Europe in 1361 in an outbreak that contemporaries called the Second Pestilence, or the Pestilence of Children, because it seemed to disproportionately affect those who had been born after the initial outbreak and therefore had no immunity from surviving. The first wave, it returned again in 1369 and again in 1374, and in various local and regional outbreaks throughout the rest of the 14th century and well into the 15th and 16th centuries. The Great Plague of London in 1665 was the same disease striking a city that had been periodically afflicted with plague outbreaks for 300 years. The plague did not finally disappear from Western Europe until the early 18th century, 350 years after the Black Death. The reasons for its eventual disappearance are still debated by historians and epidemiologists. Some have argued that changes in the rat population, specifically the gradual replacement of the black rat by the brown rat, which tends to live further from human habitation, reduced the frequency of rat to human transmission. Others have pointed to improvements in housing construction that made it harder for rats to live in close proximity to people. Others have suggested that human populations developed some genetic resistance to the bacterium over generations of exposure. The truth is probably a combination of all of these factors operating over a long period of time. What is certain is that the plague that arrived in Europe in 1347 did not leave cleanly or completely for 3.5 centuries, and that the world it shaped during those centuries is the world from which the modern era emerged. The economic consequences of the Black Death were enormous and in many ways paradoxical. The immediate economic effects of the plague were catastrophic. Trade collapsed, agricultural production plummeted, markets that had been busy and profitable fell silent, debts went uncollected because the creditors were dead, contracts went unfulfilled because the parties to them were dead. Property changed hands in ways that no existing legal framework had been designed to manage on such a scale. Estates that had been in families for generations passed to distant relatives, or to the church, or to no one at all, because every member of the family was dead. But the longer-term economic consequences of the plague were in many ways the opposite of catastrophic. Labor was suddenly scarce. The workers who had survived found themselves in a position they had never occupied before. For the first time in generations, there were more jobs than there were people to fill them. Landlords who had previously been able to keep wages low because there was always a surplus of labor willing to work for any price, now found that their surviving workers could demand higher wages, and that if those demands were not met, the workers would simply go elsewhere. This shift in the balance of economic power between landowners and laborers was one of the most significant long-term consequences of the plague. The feudal system, which had depended on a large surplus population of unfree peasants tied to the land and obligated to work it for minimal compensation, began to crack under the pressure of the new economic reality. Peasants who had previously been legally bound to their lord's estate began to move to other estates where conditions were better, or to towns where the demand for skilled workers was even more acute. Landlords who tried to hold wages down by law found the laws increasingly difficult to enforce when the people they were trying to control had options they had never had before. The English peasants' revolt of 1381 was a direct consequence of the changed world. The English government's response to the labour shortage caused by the plague was to pass legislation attempting to fix wages at pre-plague levels. The Statute of Labourers of 1351 made it illegal for workers to demand wages higher than those paid before the plague, and illegal for employers to pay more than those rates. The legislation was deeply resented by the surviving peasantry, who understood perfectly well that their labour was now worth more than it had been before, and who were being legally prevented from realising that value. 30 years of simmering resentment, combined with the introduction of a poll tax that fell disproportionately on the poorest members of society, produced in 1381 the most significant popular uprising in English medieval history. The Peasants' Revolt, led by figures including Wat Tyler and the radical priest John Ball, drew tens of thousands of peasants from Kent and Essex who marched on London, burned the palace of John of Gaunt, opened the prisons, executed the Archbishop of Canterbury, and briefly occupied the Tower of London. The young King Richard II, aged 14, met the rebels at Smithfield in a confrontation that ended with the killing of Wat Tyler by the Lord Mayor of London and the subsequent suppression of the revolt by the nobility. The leaders of the revolt were captured and executed. The promises Richard had made to the rebels were immediately withdrawn. In the short term, the revolt failed, but the underlying economic forces that had produced it continued to operate regardless of what the law said. Serfdom in England effectively ended within a few generations, not because the nobility chose to end it, but because the plague had created the economic conditions in which it was no longer possible to maintain. The plague weakened the church and created space for new ways of thinking. The institutional church entered the plague years as the most powerful and pervasive institution in European life. It emerged from them, diminished, questioned, and in some ways fundamentally damaged. The mortality among the clergy was disproportionate because priests and friars were required by their vocation to be present with the sick and dying in ways that exposed them constantly to infection. The result was a severe shortage of clergy that forced the church to ordain replacement priests very quickly and with much less rigorous training than had previously been the norm. The quality of the clergy declined. The standards of religious life fell. More damaging than the practical decline in clerical quality was the theological question that the plague raised and that the church could not satisfactorily answer. If God had sent the plague as punishment for human sinfulness, why had the most devout members of the community, the priests and monks and nuns who had devoted their lives to God, died at the same rate or higher than the sinful laity? Why had the prayers of the faithful done nothing to stop the dying? Why had the relics of saints and the intercession of the Virgin and the elaborate sacramental system of the Church proved completely ineffective against a disease that killed indiscriminately? These were questions that devout medieval Christians asked themselves, and that their priests and bishops were unable to answer convincingly. The answers that were offered were not without theological logic, but they were cold comfort to a parent watching a child die, despite every prayer and every sacrament that could be administered. The cracks that the plague opened in the authority of the institutional church widened gradually over the following century and a half, until they became the fractures of the Protestant Reformation that permanently divided the Christian world of Western Europe in ways that are still visible today. The plague inspired some of the greatest literature the medieval world produced. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote the Decameron in the years immediately following the plague. A collection of 100 stories told by 10 young Florentines who have retreated to a country house outside Florence to escape the plague raging in the city. Over 10 days they tell each other stories ranging from the bawdy to the tragic to the philosophical, while the world outside their pleasant garden continues to die. The framing device, the plague as the context from which the storytellers have temporarily escaped, gives the entire collection an undertone of mortality that the comedy and romance of the individual stories cannot entirely dispel. The Decameron is one of the founding texts of European prose literature, and it could only have been written by someone who had lived through the plague and who needed to find a form in which the experience could be held at a distance long enough to be transformed into art. William Langland's Piers Plowman, written in England in the decades after the plague, is a long allegorical poem that engages directly with the social disruption caused by the epidemic, the shortage of labour, the breakdown of the feudal order, the corruption of the clergy, the suffering of the poor. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing the Canterbury Tales in the 1380s and 90s, was writing in a world that had been shaped by the plague in every dimension. The social mobility, the irreverence toward authority, the voices of ordinary people speaking with confidence and humour about their own lives, the mixing of ranks and types on the road to Canterbury, all of this reflects a society that had been remade by the plague in ways that made the old hierarchies harder to maintain, and the voices of the previously voiceless harder to silence. Literature after the plague was different from literature before it, because the people who wrote it had seen things that no previous generation of European writers had been required to see, and they could not write as though those things had not happened. The plague changed how people thought about the human body and about medicine. The complete failure of existing medicine to do anything about the plague did not immediately discredit the Galenic framework. Medical traditions do not collapse overnight simply because they fail to address a single challenge. But the plague did create a new urgency in the study of the human body and a new willingness to question received authority that would eventually contribute to the medical revolution of the Renaissance and beyond. The need to understand what was happening in the bodies of plague victims led to an increased willingness to perform post-mortem examinations and to examine the internal organs of the dead for evidence of the disease. These observations contributed to a culture of direct anatomical investigation that would eventually produce an entirely new understanding of human anatomy based on what could actually be seen in a dissected body, rather than on what ancient authorities had said centuries earlier. The plague also produced advances in public health practice that were among the most significant institutional innovations of the medieval period. The city of Venice developed the practice of quarantine in the later 14th century. Ships arriving at Venice from plague-affected regions were required to anchor offshore for a period of 30 days, later extended to 40 days. The quarantina, from which the word quarantine derives, before anyone on board was permitted to come ashore. The practice spread to other ports and became one of the foundational tools of public health management that has been used in every epidemic since. The word quarantine, derived from the Italian for 40 days, entered virtually every European language as a direct legacy of the Black Death. Like mausoleum and colossus and pharos, it is a word still in daily use that carries within it the memory of a specific historical moment of terrible urgency. The Black Death changed art and the way Europeans thought about death and beauty. The art of the period before the Black Death was dominated by the conventions of Byzantine and early Gothic religious imagery, formal, hierarchical, golden, concerned with the divine and the eternal rather than the human and the mortal. The art that emerged in the decades after the plague was different in ways that are visible even to an untrained eye. It was more concerned with the human body, its suffering, its mortality, its physical reality. Images of the crucified Christ became more graphic, more physically agonized. The body on the cross was no longer the serene and transcendent figure of earlier art, but a suffering human body with wounds that bled and ribs that showed and a face contorted by real pain. The Virgin Mary was shown not as a serene and distant queen of heaven, but as a grieving mother holding the dead body of her son in images of the Pieta that made the connection between divine suffering and the human suffering of the plague years explicit and visceral. The Dance of Death imagery appeared on church walls across Europe, showing skeletal death taking the hand of pope and emperor, merchant and peasant, young and old, and leading them all in the same dance toward the same destination. The message was the same one the plague had delivered in person. Death is democratic. No rank and no wealth and no virtue will save you when your time comes. The art of the later 14th and 15th centuries is an art made by people who had looked directly at mass death and who could not unsee what they had seen. It is darker than what came before it, more physical, more honest about mortality, and in its darkness more fully and more permanently human. The survivors of the plague built a different world from the one they had lost. It would be an overstatement to say that the Black Death caused the Renaissance. Historical causation is never that simple, but it would not be an overstatement to say that the plague created many of the conditions from which the Renaissance emerged. The demographic collapse created labor scarcity, which created economic mobility. Economic mobility created social fluidity, which created new opportunities for talent to rise, regardless of the rank into which it had been born. The questioning of ecclesiastical authority created intellectual space for new ideas about the relationship between human beings and the divine. The new attention to the human body that the plague years demanded contributed to the humanist interest in the human form that would produce the painting and sculpture and literature of the Italian Renaissance. The survivors of the plague were, in a brutal sense, selected. They had lived through something that had killed half of everyone they knew. They had made decisions, some good and some terrible, about how to live in the face of death. They had rebuilt institutions that had collapsed. They had found new ways of organizing work and worship and community in the absence of the people and the frameworks that had previously organized them. The world they rebuilt was not the world that had existed before the plague. It could not be, because the plague had made too many things permanently different. But it was a world, a living, working, breathing, arguing, creating world, and the people who built it deserved to be understood not as victims, but as survivors in the fullest and most active sense of that word. They went on, against every reason not to, against the evidence of their own eyes and the testimony of their own grief. They went on, and in going on, they gave us the world we live in now. The Black Death is not simply history. It speaks directly to the present. Every major epidemic in recorded history since the Black Death has been shaped by what the Black Death taught. The concept of quarantine developed in Venice in the 14th century was still being used in the 21st century. The challenge of understanding how a new disease spreads when no one knows what is causing it is the same challenge medieval physicians faced in 1348 as modern epidemiologists face at the beginning of any new outbreak. The social responses to epidemic disease, the search for someone to blame, the conflict between individual freedom and the collective measures needed to contain contagion, the strain on healthcare systems, the economic disruption, the psychological toll on survivors. All of these are recognizable from the 14th century in the epidemics of every subsequent era. The Black Death was not the last pandemic. It will not be the last thing that tests the capacity of human civilization to absorb catastrophe and continue. What the 14th century tells us is that continuation is possible, that a world that has lost half its people can rebuild, that institutions that have failed can be replaced by better ones, that art and literature and music and philosophy do not stop in the face of mass death, but sometimes become more truthful and more powerful because of it. That the survivors of catastrophe are not simply the remnant of what was lost, but the foundation of what comes next. The Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people. It changed the world in ways that are still visible in our institutions, our language, our art, and our understanding of disease and community and power. It is the darkest chapter in the story of human civilization. And from it, in the fullness of time, came light. And so we come gently to the end of our journey through the age of the Black Death. We have walked through the streets of Florence with Boccaccio and watched the bodies being carted to the pits. We have stood on the dock at Messina and watched the Genoese ships arrive with their dying crews. We have followed the plague roads west and north from Sicily to Paris to the shores of Norway. We have sat with the physicians who had no answers and the priests who had no comfort sufficient to the scale of the suffering. We have watched the flagellants bleed through the plague-struck cities and the Jews burn in Strasbourg for a crime they did not commit. We have seen the mass graves fill and the churches empty and the feudal order crack under the weight of its own inadequacy. We have watched the survivors pick up what remained and begin, slowly and painfully, and with extraordinary resilience, to build something new from the wreckage of what the plague had taken. The Black Death is the darkest story in this channel's journey through the past, but it is also, in its own way, a story about survival, about the stubbornness of human life in the face of the worst that biology and circumstance can bring against it, about the capacity of human beings to find meaning and beauty and connection even in the shadow of mass death, about the fact that the world did not end in 1350, even though it must have felt, to the people living through it, as though it was ending. It did not end. They continued, and so did we. If this quiet journey through one of history's darkest chapters brought you some peace tonight, I would love it if you liked or subscribed or simply left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. And if there is still some wakefulness left in you, there should be another calm history waiting on the screen for you now. But for this moment, there is nothing more to follow. Let the medieval streets grow quiet. Let the bells that rang for the dead fall silent at last. Let your breathing become slow and even and easy. The plague passed. The world continued. And tonight, in the safety of wherever you are part of the long, unbroken line of people who came through the darkness and kept going. Sleep well. Good night. The plague spread differently in different places, and some communities found ways to survive. Not every part of Europe suffered equally in the Black Death. Some regions were struck with devastating completeness. Others escaped relatively lightly, either because of their geographic isolation, their lower population density, or simply the random fortune of which infected ships or travelers happened to pass through them in the crucial weeks when the disease was first establishing itself. Poland is often cited as a region that suffered less than its neighbors, and various explanations have been offered, including the relative isolation of many Polish communities, different trade patterns that brought fewer infected goods from the West, and the decision of the Polish King Casimir III to close Poland's borders at the first news of the plague approaching from the West. The closure of borders was one of the public health responses that some authorities attempted, and that in some cases may have helped. The problem was that by the time the plague was visible in a neighboring region, it was already invisible in your own, carried by the rats and the fleas that were already in the grain stores and the market stalls. Some monasteries that closed their gates at the first sign of plague and admitted no one from outside managed to protect their communities. Others found that the plague was already inside the walls when the gates were closed, and that the closure simply meant that the monks died together with no possibility of escape for those who remained uninfected. The pattern of survival and death was not always rational or predictable. Communities that took careful precautions sometimes died. Communities that took none sometimes survived. The randomness was part of what made the epidemic so psychologically devastating. There was no consistent relationship between behavior and outcome, between virtue and survival, between caution and safety. The plague was indifferent to everything human beings valued, and that indifference was perhaps the hardest thing of all to accept. The children of the plague generation grew up in a world shaped by loss. The survivors of the first outbreak of the Black Death had to raise their children in communities that still bore the marks of what had happened. Fields that had once been productive lay untended because the people who had farmed them were dead. Villages that had once been full of families were half empty, the abandoned houses falling into disrepair at the edges of the settlement. Parish churches that had once been crowded on feast days now echoed with the voices of a congregation half the size of the one that had stood there before. The experience of loss was so pervasive that it became part of the texture of daily life in a way that later generations could not fully share. The generation born after the plague grew up among survivors who had watched their families die and who carried that experience inside them in ways that shaped how they raised their children, how they prayed, how they thought about death, and how they related to the world. There is evidence that the post-plague generation was in some respects psychologically different from the generation that had preceded it. They were more mobile, more willing to question authority, more focused on the pleasures and opportunities of the present life rather than the deferred rewards of the next. They had grown up in a world where death could come without warning, and where the institutions that were supposed to protect them had failed. That experience did not make them reckless, but it did make them realistic in ways that challenged the assumptions of the world their parents had inherited. The Black Death reached the Islamic world as well, and was understood very differently there. The plague was not only a European catastrophe. It struck the Middle East and North Africa with comparable severity, and the Islamic world developed its own frameworks for understanding and responding to the epidemic. The great Islamic scholar Ibn Battuta, the most widely travelled person of the 14th century, witnessed the plague in multiple regions during his extraordinary journeys and left accounts that complement and sometimes contradict the European sources. In the Islamic world, the theological understanding of the plague was shaped by hadith, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, which addressed plague in terms that differed significantly from the Christian response. The Prophet was recorded as saying that plague was a mercy and a martyrdom for a Muslim who remained in a plague-affected area with patience and the knowledge that nothing would befall him except what God had decreed. This teaching led many Islamic scholars to argue that Muslims should not flee from plague-affected regions, because to do so was to attempt to escape the divine will. It also meant that death from plague was understood not as punishment, but as martyrdom, a positive spiritual status rather than a negative one. The contrast with the Christian understanding, in which plague was punishment for sin, meant that the psychological experience of the epidemic was different in Islamic societies, even when the physical reality was the same. Islamic physicians also engaged seriously with the question of plague causation and developed sophisticated discussions of contagion and its mechanisms that in some respects went further than their European counterparts. Ibn al-Khatib, an Andalusian physician writing in Granada during the plague years, argued explicitly that plague was transmitted from person to person through clothing, vessels, and earrings, a proto-contagion theory that came remarkably close to the actual mechanism 1400 years before it was scientifically confirmed. His views were controversial, and he was eventually accused of heresy for them. But they represent an extraordinary moment of empirical reasoning in the middle of one of the greatest crises the medieval world had ever faced. The plague changed the landscape of Europe in ways that are still visible today. The physical landscape of Europe was altered by the Black Death in ways that persisted for generations and in some cases can still be detected today. The most dramatic changes were in areas of dense agricultural settlement, where the death of a significant portion of the farming population led to the abandonment of villages that were never resettled. In England alone, historians have identified several hundred settlements that were abandoned during or shortly after the Black Death, and that never recovered their pre-plague populations. Some of these deserted villages left physical traces in the landscape, earthworks and ridge and furrow patterns in fields that were never ploughed again after the people who had farmed them died. Others survive only in place names on maps, the Tun and Wick and Ham of settlements that no longer exist, marking the former presence of communities that the plague reduced to nothing. The abandonment of marginal farmland that had been brought into cultivation during the population expansion of the 12th and 13th centuries allowed woodland to regenerate in some areas and contributed to a gradual shift in land use patterns as surviving landowners restructured their estates around the reduced labor supply now available to work them. The shift from arable to pastoral farming in many areas of England, from growing crops to raising sheep, was partly a response to the labor shortage created by the plague, because sheep required far fewer workers to manage than grain fields. This shift in turn contributed to the enclosure of common land that displaced further communities in the centuries following the plague and created the conditions for another wave of rural depopulation whose effects also stretched far into the future. The memory of the plague shaped European culture for generations. The Black Death entered the cultural memory of Europe in ways that shaped art, literature, religion, and popular culture for the next 2 centuries and beyond. The image of the skeletal death, the Grim Reaper, that has become one of the most universally recognized symbols in Western culture, owes its visual form to the dance of death imagery that emerged from the plague years. Before the Black Death, death in European art was typically shown as an angel, a sleeping figure, or a symbolic event. After the plague, death became a personified figure, a skeleton or a skeletal body that approached the living from outside their world and claimed them regardless of who they were. This visual vocabulary of death still instantly recognizable today in everything from Halloween decorations to medical symbols to literary metaphors, was created by the Black Death and the artists who tried to give form to what they had witnessed. The Triumph of Death, a type of painting showing death overwhelming armies of the living, appeared across Europe in the late 14th and 15th centuries in versions that drew directly on the visual experience of the epidemic. The most famous surviving example, by the Flemish artist Peter Bruegel the Elder, painted in 1562, shows an army of skeletons overwhelming a world full of people engaged in every kind of human activity with a thoroughness and a democratic indifference that captures perfectly the lesson the plague had taught 2 centuries earlier. These images were not made simply to frighten. They were made to teach, to remind the living that death was always present, always near, always coming, and that the only rational response to that fact was to live well, act justly, and be prepared. What the Black Death took and what it gave in return. Any honest accounting of the Black Death has to begin with what it took. It took between 75 and 200 million lives. It took parents and children and siblings and friends and neighbors and teachers and priests. It took craftsmen whose skills died with them, and scholars whose knowledge was lost, and artists whose work was never made because the artist died before making it. It took the comfort of familiar ritual, the reassurance of institutional authority, the ordinary confidence that the world would continue to function in the ways it had always functioned. It took, from many communities, the will to continue at all. There are accounts of entire villages where the survivors simply sat down and waited to die because everyone they had known was gone, and there seemed no reason to continue. Some did not continue. Some villages were lost entirely, their last inhabitants too few and too broken to sustain the community. But most continued. Most villages, most cities, most communities found within themselves some residue of the will to go on, even when going on seemed almost impossibly hard. And in going on they found, gradually and painfully, that the world the plague had left behind contained within it possibilities that the world before the plague had not. More mobility, more power for ordinary working people, more questioning of authority, more attention to the individual human body and the individual human experience, more honesty in art about what life and death actually felt like, more urgency in philosophy about what the good life actually required. The Renaissance that followed the plague was not a gift from the plague. It was the achievement of the people who survived it. But the plague created the conditions in which those people could achieve it by breaking down the structures that had constrained human possibility and leaving behind a world that was, for all its grief and loss, more open than the one that had preceded it. The Black Death was the worst thing that ever happened to medieval Europe, and from the worst thing that ever happened to medieval Europe came the world we live in now. That is not a redemptive conclusion. No amount of subsequent achievement justifies the death of 100 million people. But it is a true conclusion. And truth, even when it is hard, is always worth the time it takes to tell it. The ships that carried the plague also carried stories, and the stories spread as fast as the disease. One of the things that made the Black Death so psychologically overwhelming was the speed with which news of it travelled ahead of the disease itself. Merchants fleeing infected cities carried stories of what they had seen. Letters from survivors in Florence or Siena reached recipients in Paris or London months before the plague itself arrived. These stories were often accurate in their descriptions of the symptoms and the speed of death, and the breakdown of social order in affected cities. They were sometimes wildly inaccurate in their explanations of cause and their predictions of geographic reach. Some letters described the plague as divine judgment on the sinful Italians and predicted that the righteous people of northern Europe would be spared. They were not spared. The psychological effect of receiving these stories and then waiting for the disease to arrive was its own form of suffering. Communities that knew the plague was coming and could do nothing to stop it had to live with that knowledge for weeks or months before the first cases appeared. Some responded with resignation and prayer. Some responded with the persecution of their neighbors. Some responded with a desperate determination to enjoy whatever life remained. Boccaccio described a segment of Florentine society that responded to the plague by throwing parties and drinking heavily and refusing to think about what was coming. A response that is entirely understandable and probably not entirely ineffective as a psychological coping mechanism, even if it did nothing for their physical health. The stories that preceded the plague were the first epidemic of information in European history, the first time that news of a medical catastrophe travelled faster than the catastrophe itself, creating a wave of fear and misinformation that ran ahead of the disease and shaped the responses of communities that had not yet been directly touched. The pattern has repeated itself in every epidemic since. The gravediggers and the body carriers of the plague years deserve to be remembered. Among the unsung figures of the Black Death were the men and women who performed the most dangerous and most necessary work of the epidemic. The gravediggers who dug the mass graves outside city walls. The body carriers who collected the dead from the houses and streets and transported them to the burial sites. The women who washed and prepared bodies for burial in the early weeks of the epidemic, before the scale of the dying made such preparations impossible. The nurses who attended the sick in the hospitals and infirmaries, knowing that the care they provided was unlikely to save the people they were caring for, and that their own proximity to the dying made their own death more likely. These people, mostly unnamed in the surviving records, mostly drawn from the lowest economic strata of medieval society, mostly compelled by necessity rather than choosing their role, performed work that kept the plague-struck cities functioning at the most basic level, even when everything else had broken down. Boccaccio noted that gravediggers demanded enormous sums for their work, and that many died doing it. He did not record their names. The chronicles of the period that record the deaths of nobles and bishops and scholars mostly pass over the deaths of the people who dug the graves in silence. But those unnamed gravediggers who kept digging when the earth was full of what they had already buried, and who went on digging until they could not dig anymore, were as essential to the survival of their communities as any physician or priest or king who has been more fully remembered. History tends to record the people who made decisions. The people who dug the holes those decisions required are harder to find in the record. They deserve to be found anyway. The animals of the plague years also suffered, and their deaths mattered. The focus in accounts of the Black Death is naturally on human suffering and human death, but the plague also killed enormous numbers of animals, whose deaths compounded the difficulties facing surviving human communities. Livestock died, not necessarily from the plague directly, since the bacterium does not affect most domestic animals the way it affects rodents and humans, but from neglect. When the farmers who tended them died, there was no one left to feed and water and shelter them. Cattle and sheep and pigs and horses wandered fields without fences because the people who had maintained the fences were dead. They starved or were taken by predators or simply wandered away. The loss of draft animals was particularly serious because the surviving human population, already depleted, now had to do without the oxen and horses that had pulled their ploughs. This compounded the agricultural crisis caused by the death of the farm workers themselves. The grain that had not been harvested because the harvesters were dead rotted in the fields. The seeds that had not been planted because the planters were dead lay unused in granaries that were themselves decaying from lack of maintenance. Contemporary chroniclers describe fields lying fallow for years after the plague, not simply because there were not enough people to work them, but because there were not enough animals to pull the equipment that working them required. The recovery of European agriculture after the Black Death was therefore not just about replacing the human population. It was about rebuilding the entire agricultural system, including its animal component, from a point of almost total collapse. That this recovery happened, that within a generation or two European agriculture had largely returned to something like its pre-plague productivity, is a testament to the resilience of agricultural communities whose knowledge and practices proved more durable than the individuals who held them. The Black Death in the historical record is preserved in words that still carry its weight. The documents that survive from the plague years have a quality that distinguishes them from ordinary historical records. There is in many of them a directness, an urgency, a willingness to state plainly what was happening that reflects the fact that the writers knew they might not survive to revise what they had written. The will of a merchant in Siena, written in 1348, that begins by acknowledging that the testator does not expect to recover from the illness he is suffering, is a different kind of document from an ordinary will. The letter of a Florentine banker to his business partner in Barcelona, describing what he has seen in the streets of Florence and warning his partner to take every precaution he can, is a different kind of letter from an ordinary business communication. These documents are saturated with the knowledge of imminent death in a way that gives them an emotional charge that ordinary historical records do not carry. They are also, in many cases, the last words of people who did not know they were writing their last words and who were trying to communicate something true and urgent to people they cared about and might never see again. Reading them across the distance of 670 years is to feel the weight of individual human lives pressing against the generality of historical statistics. The Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people. That sentence is true and important and entirely inadequate. The reality was 75 to 200 million individual moments of dying, each one attended by its own particular grief and its own particular loss, each one leaving behind its own particular absence in the lives of those who survived. The documents that survive from the plague years give us access to some small number of those individual moments. They are worth reading slowly and with attention because they are doing what all the best historical evidence does. They are insisting that the people they describe were real. The Black Death and what it means to remember catastrophe. There is a question that sits beneath any account of the Black Death and that becomes more pressing the longer you think about it. Why do we tell these stories? Why do we spend time, particularly quiet, nighttime time, thinking about a catastrophe that killed 100 million people 6 centuries ago? The answer is not simply that it is interesting, though it is. It is not simply that it is important, though it is that too. It is that remembering catastrophe is one of the most distinctively human things we do. Other animals avoid danger by instinct, by the memory of their own experience, by the warning signals of others in their immediate group. Human beings do something more unusual. We remember and retell the experiences of people who lived centuries before us, and we use those memories to understand our own world and our own situation. The Black Death happened 670 years ago. None of the people who lived through it are alive. None of their children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren are alive. And yet the story of what happened to them is still worth telling and still worth hearing, because it tells us something true about what human beings are like when the world stops making sense. How we look for explanations and sometimes find the wrong ones. How we look for someone to blame and sometimes choose the wrong person. How we abandon each other and care for each other and rebuild and go on even when going on seems impossible. How the worst things that happen to us sometimes create the conditions for the best things that come after. These are not lessons unique to the 14th century. They are lessons about being human in any century. The Black Death teaches them with a clarity and a force that no other event in human history quite matches. And that is why we are still here, in the quiet of a late night, telling its story and listening to what it has to say. The plague doctors who faced the epidemic deserve more than a costume. The image of the medieval plague doctor in his beaked mask and long black coat has become one of the most recognizable symbols of the epidemic. It appears on merchandise and in Halloween costumes, and in the visual language of horror and dark fantasy. The reality behind the image is more complicated and more interesting. Plague physicians in the 14th century faced an impossible task. They were trained in a medical tradition that gave them no tools adequate to what they were confronting. They had no effective treatments. They had no correct theory of causation. They were working entirely in the dark in a situation where the consequences of their ignorance were measured in human lives, including their own. Many plague physicians died. The mortality among physicians was comparable to or higher than that of the general population, because their work brought them into constant close contact with the sick. Some physicians fled. Some refused to attend plague patients. These men have been condemned by historians, writing from the safety of later centuries, but the condemnation deserves some qualification. A physician who attended plague patients without understanding how the disease was transmitted was not simply exposing himself to risk. He was exposing himself to near certain death in exchange for the ability to provide comfort, but not cure to people who were going to die, regardless of what he did. The physicians who did attend, who did go into the plague houses and the hospital wards, who did their best with the tools they had, while knowing those tools were inadequate, deserve recognition for a kind of courage that the modern world can sometimes forget was required of medical practitioners in the pre-antibiotic era. Guy de Chauliac, the physician who attended Pope Clement VI at Avignon, and who himself contracted the plague and survived, wrote one of the most detailed medical accounts of the epidemic. He was honest about his own fear. He wrote that he remained in Avignon only so as not to incur infamy, and that he was in continual fear. That honesty is itself a form of courage. He stayed. He treated. He wrote down what he saw, and in writing it down, he gave later generations one of their most valuable direct accounts of what the plague looked like from inside. The monasteries and convents of the plague years were among the hardest hit institutions. The religious houses of medieval Europe were in many respects perfectly designed to maximize the spread of infectious disease. They housed large numbers of people living in close quarters, sharing dormitories, refectories, chapels, and common spaces. They were centers of charitable activity that brought the sick and the poor into direct contact with the religious community. Their rules of communal life, the gathering in the chapel for multiple daily offices, the shared meals in the refectory, the communal work in the cloister, all created conditions that were ideal for the transmission of the pneumonic form of the plague once it had entered the community. Many monasteries and convents lost the majority of their members in the first outbreak. Some were entirely wiped out. The records of houses that survived show the election of new abbots and priors at intervals of weeks or months as successive holders of the office died. The disruption to the contemplative and scholarly life of the monasteries was enormous and long-lasting. The scriptoria, where monks copied manuscripts and preserved the intellectual heritage of the ancient world, fell silent or worked at reduced capacity. The schools attached to monasteries and cathedrals that had educated the sons of the nobility lost their teachers and many of their students. The libraries that housed the accumulated learning of centuries were left untended in houses where there were no longer enough surviving members to maintain the basic routines of religious life, let alone its scholarly dimensions. The recovery of monastic life after the plague was slow and uneven. Some houses rebuilt their communities within a generation. Others never fully recovered their pre-plague size or scholarly reputation. The long-term effect on the intellectual life of the church was one of the factors that created the conditions for the emergence of secular centers of learning. The universities that had been founded in the 12th and 13th centuries and that gradually took over from the monasteries as the primary institutions of higher learning in European society. The children who survived the plague grew up surrounded by its absence. Among the most poignant aspects of the Black Death is what happened to the children who survived. Some lost one parent, some lost both, some lost everyone they knew. The orphan problem created by the plague was of a scale that medieval social institutions had no mechanism to address. The church operated orphanages, but nothing on the scale that was suddenly required. Wealthier families could sometimes take in the children of dead relatives. In the chaos of the epidemic years, many children were simply absorbed into whatever household would take them, often as servants or laborers, rather than as members of a family. The children who grew up in this way, raised in households not their own, in communities that remembered the dead, surrounded by empty houses and untended fields, and the permanent silence of names that were no longer spoken because there was no one left to speak them. These children carried the plague inside them in a different way from those who had died of it. They carried it as an absence, a before and after, a knowledge that the world they had been born into had been unmade, and that what they were growing up in was something new and not yet fully shaped. Some of them became the artists who made the danse macabre. Some became the poets who wrote about the shortness of life and the necessity of living it fully. Some became the reformers who questioned the authority of institutions that had failed so completely when they were needed most. Some simply became farmers and craftsmen and parents themselves, raising children of their own in a world that was slowly, imperfectly, and with enormous effort becoming habitable again. All of them were shaped by what they had survived, and the world they shaped was different because of what had happened to them. The long shadow of the Black Death stretches across centuries of European history. Historians sometimes divide the history of medieval Europe into before and after the Black Death, with the epidemic serving as the watershed between two fundamentally different eras. The Europe before the Black Death was a world of expanding population, increasing agricultural production, growing towns and cities, elaborate hierarchies of feudal obligation, and a church whose authority over the spiritual and intellectual life of the continent was nearly total. The Europe after the Black Death was smaller in population, but larger in possibility. Its workers had more power. Its peasants had more mobility. Its artists were more interested in the individual human body and the individual human experience. Its thinkers were more willing to question received authority. Its merchants were accumulating the wealth that would finance the exploration and the art and the science of the following centuries. The Black Death was not the only force that produced these changes. History is always multi-causal, and the transition from medieval to early modern Europe had many drivers, of which the plague was one. But it was the most dramatic single event in that transition, the one that accelerated changes that were already underway and forced the development of new institutions and new ways of thinking in a compressed period of time that might otherwise have taken generations. The world that the Black Death made was not a better world than the one it destroyed. It was a world whose possibilities were different, whose constraints were different, whose understanding of human life and human death had been permanently altered by the experience of the worst thing that had ever happened to it. From that altered understanding came the Renaissance, and from the Renaissance came the scientific revolution, and from the scientific revolution came the medicine that eventually identified the bacterium and developed the antibiotics that can now treat bubonic plague within days and cure it completely. The circle closes, not neatly, but truly. The disease that killed 100 million people helped create the civilization that learned to defeat it, the last cases of plague in Europe, and what finally ended it. The Black Death of the 14th century was the beginning of a plague era that lasted in Europe for 3.5 centuries. During that period there were repeated outbreaks of varying severity that continued to shape European demography and culture long after the initial catastrophe had been absorbed. The Great Plague of London in 1665 killed approximately 100,000 people, roughly a quarter of the city's population at the time, in the last major outbreak of plague in England. It was followed the next year by the Great Fire of London, which destroyed much of the medieval city, and which was later credited by some contemporaries with burning out the last reservoir of plague infection in the city. Whether the fire actually contributed to ending the plague in London is uncertain. The timing is suggestive, but the mechanism is unclear. The last major European epidemic of plague struck Marseille in France in 1720 and killed approximately 50,000 people, roughly half the city's population. After Marseille, the plague retreated from Western Europe and did not return as an epidemic force. It remained endemic in parts of Asia and Africa and produced the third pandemic beginning in China in 1855 that spread globally and killed 12 million people before the identification of the bacterium in 1894 and the development of effective antibiotics in the 20th century finally gave medicine the tools to address it. Plague still exists today. Cases of bubonic plague are reported every year in parts of North America, Africa, and Asia. They are almost invariably cured with antibiotics when diagnosed promptly. The disease that reshaped the world in the 14th century is now a manageable medical condition treated in a matter of days. The distance between that fact and what Boccaccio described in Florence in 1348 is one of the most extraordinary measures of human progress that the history of medicine can offer. The towns and cities that survived the plague and how they rebuilt themselves. One of the most remarkable things about the Black Death is not simply how many people it killed, but how quickly the survivors began to rebuild. The impulse to continue, to repair what was broken, to fill what was empty, asserted itself with extraordinary speed, even in communities that had lost half or more of their population. In Florence, which lost perhaps 60% of its people in the first outbreak, the great building projects that had been underway before the plague were resumed within years of the epidemic's passing. The Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, whose famous dome by Brunelleschi would become one of the defining architectural achievements of the Renaissance, continued to be built in the decades after the Black Death in a city that was still only a fraction of its former size. The merchants and bankers of Florence who had survived continued to invest in art and architecture and trade as though the future remained worth building for. Which it did. Which it always had. The impulse that drives human beings to build cathedrals and commission paintings and write poetry and do business and plant vineyards proved more durable than the plague that had killed so many of the people who felt it. The towns of northern Europe that had been struck in 1348 and 1349 repaired their walls and restocked their markets, and elected new mayors, and argued with their bishops and collected their taxes, and did all the ordinary things that towns do as though the extraordinary thing that had just happened to them was something to be absorbed and continued from, rather than surrendered to. Not every community succeeded in this. Some did not recover. Some remained depleted and diminished for generations. But the majority found within themselves the capacity to continue, and that capacity, repeated across hundreds of communities across the whole of Europe, is one of the most extraordinary collective achievements in human history. It received no monument. It produced no hero. It was simply the daily decision of millions of ordinary people to get up in the morning and try again. History records the decision in aggregate, in population statistics and economic recovery curves, and the dates of new building projects. What it cannot fully capture is the individual human weight of each of those decisions, made in grief and exhaustion and uncertainty by people who had no way of knowing whether the plague was truly over or simply resting. The music of the plague years and what people sang while the world was dying. Among the cultural responses to the Black Death that are most difficult to fully reconstruct is the musical one. Music in the medieval period was primarily a performance art, and performances leave no recordings. What survives is notation, and the notation of the 14th century is rich enough to tell us something about what people sang during and after the plague years. The musical form known as the ars nova, the new art, developed in France and Italy in the early 14th century and continued through the plague years, showing a new complexity and expressiveness that some musicologists have connected to the emotional intensity of the epidemic period. The Italian composer Francesco Landini, born around 1325 and therefore a child during the first outbreak of the plague, became the most celebrated musician of the later 14th century in the city of Florence. He was blind from childhood, possibly from smallpox, and he played the organ and composed music of extraordinary refinement and emotional depth. His ballad, secular songs for voice and instruments, show a concern with the beauty and brevity of life, with the pleasures of love and nature and music itself, that reflects the sensibility of a generation that had grown up in the shadow of mass death and that had learned, perhaps more viscerally than any generation before it, that the present moment was not to be taken for granted. The hymns and laments composed for the flagellant processions survive in some manuscripts, and they are among the most direct musical expressions of the emotional reality of the epidemic. They are not sophisticated compositions. They are simple, repetitive, powerful songs designed to be sung by large groups of non-musicians in a state of extreme emotional and physical stress. They speak in the most direct possible terms about sin and death and the hope of divine mercy. To read the texts of these songs, even without hearing them sung, is to feel something of the desperation that produced them, the food that people ate during the plague years, and how hunger and disease worked together. The relationship between nutrition and susceptibility to infectious disease is one that medieval people could not have articulated in scientific terms, but that they experienced in practice with terrible regularity. The Great Famine that preceded the Black Death by 2 decades had left significant portions of the European population chronically malnourished. Malnourished populations have weakened immune systems. Weakened immune systems are less able to mount effective responses to infectious disease. The combination of pre-existing nutritional stress and the arrival of a virulent new pathogen was therefore more devastating than either factor would have been alone. The regions that suffered most severely in the Black Death were often regions that had also suffered most severely in the famine years. The people who were most likely to die were those whose bodies were already compromised by years of inadequate nutrition. This does not mean that well-nourished people were immune. The plague killed healthy adults in their prime as readily as it killed the weak, but the margin between survival and death was in many cases determined by factors that included the overall health and nutritional status of the victim, which in the plague years was often poor even before the infection began. The agricultural collapse that followed the plague created new problems of food supply for the survivors. Fields that had not been planted or harvested because the farmers were dead left communities facing shortage even as the epidemic was receding. The first years after the Black Death in many regions were years of both plague and hunger simultaneously. A double crisis that tested the survival capacity of communities that had already been brought to the edge of what they could bear. The religious art that emerged from the plague years, and why it still matters. Some of the most extraordinary works of art in the Western tradition were made in the century following the Black Death by artists who were either survivors of the epidemic themselves or who grew up in communities where its effects were still visible and palpable. The Franciscan friar, Fra Angelico, born around 1395 and therefore of the second generation after the plague, painted images of the sacred that combine the formal tradition of medieval religious art with a new tenderness and humanity that reflects the changed relationship between the human and the divine that the plague had forced on those who survived it. His figures are recognizably human in a way that pre-plague sacred art often was not. They feel, they grieve, they hope. They exist in a specific physical world with light and shadow and space rather than the gold ground of Byzantine abstraction. The Flemish painter Jan van Eyck, working in the 1420s and 30s, painted the visible world with a precision and a detail that had never been achieved before in European art. Every object in his paintings is rendered with a fidelity to physical reality that reflects a new interest in the material world, in what things actually look like, in how light falls on fabric and skin and metal that is inseparable from the cultural shifts the plague had initiated. The world was real. The body was real. The present moment was real. These were the lessons the plague had taught, and the greatest artists of the century, after it encoded those lessons in their art, in ways that are still visible to anyone who stands before their paintings today. Art after the plague was different from art before it, because the people who made it had been changed by what had happened to the world they lived in. They had looked at death directly, and they had kept looking until they found in it not only horror, but also, eventually, a new and harder and more honest kind of beauty. The women of the plague years who kept communities alive while the records ignored them. Medieval historical records are largely written by and about men. The women of the plague years appear in them only intermittently, and usually obliquely. But the work of keeping plague-struck communities functioning fell disproportionately on women, as it has in most epidemic situations throughout history. Women nursed the sick in the household when male physicians refused to attend. Women managed the family economies when husbands and fathers died. Women ran the businesses that had belonged to their dead husbands in the absence of any surviving male heir to take them over. Women ran the convents that served as hospitals and refuges in communities where the male religious houses had been decimated. Women prepared the dead for burial in the early weeks of the epidemic, before the scale of the dying made individual preparation impossible. Women raised the orphaned children of their dead neighbors and relatives alongside their own children, extending their households to include the survivors of families that had ceased to exist. The legal status of women in the post-plague period reflects in some regions a temporary expansion of their formal rights and roles that occurred because there were simply not enough men to fill the positions that men had previously monopolized. Women appear in business records and legal documents of the later 14th century in greater numbers than before the epidemic, acting independently in commercial and legal contexts that would previously have required a male intermediary. This expansion of female economic and legal activity was not permanent. As the male population recovered in subsequent generations, the pressure to reassert traditional gender roles increased, and the temporary openings created by male mortality largely closed again. But in the plague years and the decades immediately following them, the women of Europe exercised a degree of agency and autonomy that the records of the period, written mostly by and for men, imperfectly but genuinely reflect. The question of immunity and why some people survived when others did not. From the beginning of the Black Death, people noticed that some individuals survived exposure to the plague that killed their neighbors. Some of those who nursed the sick and handled the dead never developed the disease. Some who were struck by it recovered. The mechanisms of individual variation in susceptibility to the plague bacterium were entirely unknown in the 14th century, but they are better understood today. Modern genetic research has identified variants in certain human genes, particularly genes associated with the immune response, that appear to provide some degree of protection against plague. A variant in a gene called CCR5, which codes for a receptor on immune cells, has been found at higher frequencies in European populations than in populations less affected by plague, and has been proposed as evidence of natural selection operating on the human genome during the centuries of repeated plague exposure. The same variant also happens to provide some protection against HIV infection, which has led to the fascinating if sobering observation that the immune advantage developed by European populations during the plague centuries may still be affecting the susceptibility of their descendants to a completely different infectious disease today. Evolution operates slowly, but it operates. The people who survived the Black Death were not simply fortunate. In many cases, they were genetically different in small but measurable ways from the people who died. Their descendants carried those genetic differences. Those differences accumulated through successive plague outbreaks over 3 centuries and the European populations that emerged from the plague era were in subtle but real ways biologically different from those that had entered it. The Black Death changed not just the culture and the economy and the institutions of Europe. It changed the biology of the people who survived it in ways that are still present in the genomes of their living descendants today. The silence after the plague, and what it sounded like to live in a world half empty. One of the things that is hardest to reconstruct about the Black Death is the silence, not the absence of sound, but the particular silence of a world that has lost half its voices. Contemporary accounts try to describe it. Boccaccio speaks of streets that had been full, now lying empty. A Sienese chronicler named Agnolo di Tura describes burying his 5 children with his own hands because there was no one left to help him. He writes that so many died that everyone believed it was the end of the world. That phrase, the end of the world, appears in multiple accounts from different regions, not as metaphor, as a genuine description of how it felt. The world as they had known it had ended. The world that replaced it was smaller, quieter, emptier, full of absences where presences had been. The house of the dead neighbor standing empty at the end of the street. The place in the pew that had been occupied by the same family for generations, now vacant. The fields that no one planted. The bells that no one rang. These silences accumulated into a particular atmosphere that pervaded European communities in the years following the plague, and that took a generation or more to fully dissipate. Children who had grown up in the silence of the post-plague world had a different relationship to community and to death and to the fragility of the ordinary than any generation that came before or after. They had grown up knowing that the world could go quiet, that the voices could stop, that the ordinary rhythms of daily life were not guaranteed, but depended on the continued existence of the people who made them. That knowledge, absorbed in childhood and carried into adult life, shaped how they built their world and what they valued about it in ways that reverberate through the art and literature and religion of the century that followed the Black Death. The trade in plague remedies and the people who profited from catastrophe. Every catastrophe produces its profiteers, and the Black Death was no exception. As the plague spread through Europe, a market emerged for remedies, preventatives, and explanations that ranged from the useless to the actively harmful, and that extracted money from desperate people who had nothing else to try. Apothecaries sold preparations of theriac, an ancient antidote of Greek origin that had been used against poisons and venoms for centuries, and that was pressed into service against the plague with no evidence of effectiveness. Theriac was expensive, complex to prepare, and entirely without benefit against Yersinia pestis. It sold in enormous quantities because people needed to do something, and theriac was the most prestigious remedy available. Physicians sold consultations and prescriptions that they knew were unlikely to help because the alternative was to offer nothing at all, and offering nothing at all in a situation of total terror was not something most physicians were willing to do. Astrologers sold horoscopes and predictions. Relics of saints were brought out and processed through the streets of cities in ceremonies that gathered large crowds in close proximity, and may in some cases have accelerated the spread of the pneumonic form of the disease. The sellers of protective amulets and lucky charms did a brisk trade. The people who claimed to know which way the plague was coming and which roads should be avoided sold their knowledge to those who could pay for it. Some of this information was useful. Most of it was not. The profiteering that occurred during the plague years was not driven primarily by malice. It was driven by the same desperation that motivated the buyers. In a world where the disease could not be stopped and could not be treated, and where the only certainty was that it was killing people all around you, the need to do something, anything, was overwhelming. The sellers of remedies met that need even when the remedies were worthless, because meeting the need felt better to everyone involved than acknowledging that nothing could be done. How the Black Death was recorded and what the records tell us. The documentary record of the Black Death is richer than you might expect for a catastrophe that killed so many of the people who could write. Medieval European society produced large quantities of written records, and many of them survived the plague precisely because paper and parchment are more durable than the people who wrote on them. The records that survive tell us about the plague from many different angles. Administrative records tell us how many clergy died in a given diocese and how quickly replacements were found. Wills and probate records tell us about the transfer of property in the plague years and about the family structures that were disrupted. Municipal records tell us about the measures cities took to manage the epidemic, the appointment of plague officers, the organization of burial, the regulation of markets and public gatherings. Medical texts tell us about the theories that physicians held and the treatments they recommended, however ineffective those treatments were. Literary accounts like the Decameron and the Chronicles of Villani tell us about the human experience of the epidemic with a vividness and a specificity that administrative records cannot match. Epistolary sources, the letters that survive, tell us about the experience of individuals trying to understand what was happening to them and communicate that understanding to people they loved. Archaeological evidence tells us about the mass graves themselves, about the demographics of mortality, about the health status of the victims before they died. The convergence of all these different types of evidence gives historians a picture of the Black Death that is more detailed and more humanly immediate than the picture we have of almost any other pre-modern catastrophe. The Black Death is one of the best documented disasters in human history, and the documentation exists partly because the disaster was so overwhelming that even the people who were dying felt the urgency of writing it down. The world that came after, and the thread that connects it to the present day. There is a thread that runs from the mass graves of Florence in 1348 to the hospital ward, the public health department, the antibiotic prescription of today. It is not a straight thread. It doubles back on itself and frays, and sometimes disappears for stretches before reappearing further along. But it is continuous. The observation that some people seem to resist the plague led eventually to the concept of immunity, which led eventually to vaccination. The institution of quarantine in Venice in 1377 led eventually to the international health regulations that govern the management of epidemic disease today. The post-mortem examinations performed on plague victims contributed to the culture of anatomical investigation that led eventually to the understanding of how the human body actually works. The failure of medieval medicine to address the plague created the urgency that drove the medical revolution of the subsequent centuries. The economic disruption of the plague created the conditions for the emergence of early capitalism and the merchant banking system that financed the age of exploration and the scientific revolution. The questioning of ecclesiastical authority that the plague accelerated contributed to the Reformation that permanently changed the religious landscape of Europe, and through that change shaped the political history of the modern world. None of these developments were caused solely by the plague, but all of them were shaped by it in ways that made them different from what they would have been in a world that had not experienced the Black Death. We live in that shaped world. The medicine we use, the institutions we inhabit, the art we have inherited, the words we use, including the word quarantine that the Venetians gave us, All of these carry within them the distant imprint of what happened in the 14th century. The dead of the Black Death are so long dead that no one alive is descended from anyone who was alive when the plague was killing. But the world those dead people made by dying and by surviving is the world we were born into. And that connection, invisible but real, is the most important reason to know their story and to tell it with care. The saints and the intercessors that people turned to during the plague years. In a world where medicine had no answers and authority had no solutions, people turned to the supernatural for help with a desperation that the records of the period make palpable even today. The saints who were considered most effective against plague became among the most widely venerated in the Catholic world. Saint Sebastian, a Roman martyr traditionally depicted as tied to a post and pierced by arrows, was adopted as a plague patron because the arrows piercing his body were understood as an image of the plague's sudden attacks. Images of Saint Sebastian appeared on church walls across Europe, and his intercession was sought by communities terrified of the disease. Saint Roche, a French pilgrim of the 14th century who had himself contracted plague and recovered miraculously, was venerated as another plague patron. He was typically shown pointing to a plague bubo on his thigh, a remarkably direct image for a religious icon, and was believed to intercede for those who prayed to him for protection. The Virgin Mary, as the most powerful intercessor in the Catholic tradition, was called upon constantly during the plague years in prayers and processions and special masses that drew enormous crowds of desperate worshippers. The image of the Madonna della Misericordia, the Virgin of Mercy spreading her cloak to shelter the faithful beneath it, became one of the most popular devotional images of the plague era. It showed the Virgin protecting her people from the arrows of plague with her own body, interposing herself between the afflicted community and the divine judgment that was striking it. These images were not merely decorative, they were functional. They expressed in visual form the emotional and spiritual needs of communities under unbearable stress, and they provided a framework of meaning and hope in a situation where hope was otherwise very difficult to sustain. Whether or not the prayers and the processions and the intercessions had any effect on the course of the disease, they had an effect on the people who offered them. They kept communities together when the impulse to flee and abandon each other was overwhelming. They created occasions for collective expression of grief and fear, and hope that the isolated experience of individual dying could not provide. They were not medicine, but in the fullest sense of what it means to care for suffering people, they were not nothing. The slow return of normal life and what normal meant after the plague. The recovery from the Black Death was not a single event. It was a process that lasted decades and unfolded differently in different communities across Europe. Some towns returned to something like their pre-plague size and activity within a generation, as migrants filled the empty houses and new births gradually replaced the dead. Others took 2 or 3 generations. Some never recovered the population density they had achieved before the epidemic. The Europe of 1400 was smaller than the Europe of 1345, and it would not return to pre-plague population levels until the 16th century, more than 150 years after the Black Death. The return of normal life was further complicated by the recurrence of the plague, which struck again in 1361 and 1369, and periodically throughout the rest of the 14th century. Communities that had begun to rebuild were struck again, and had to begin again. The cumulative effect of repeated plague outbreaks across the second half of the 14th century kept European populations depressed for longer than any single outbreak would have done alone. But normal did return. Eventually, incompletely transformed, the markets reopened. The cathedrals were completed. The universities resumed their teaching. The fields were replanted. The babies were born and named and baptized, and grew up in a world that was not the world of 1345, but that was recognizably the same civilization that the plague had struck, because the survivors had chosen to rebuild it rather than abandon it. That choice, made by millions of ordinary people across a century and a half, is the most important fact about the Black Death. Not how many it killed, though that number is staggering. Not how fast it spread, though that speed was terrifying. Not the medical helplessness, or the theological confusion, or the economic disruption, though all of those were real and significant. The most important fact is that it did not end the story, that the people who survived it continued the story with grief and with courage and with the ordinary human stubbornness that refuses to accept that the end of a chapter is the end of a book. The story continued. It is still continuing. And every night, when someone settles in to listen to a quiet account of something that happened 6 centuries ago, that continuation is being enacted again in a small and peaceful way. We remember. We continue. That is enough. That is everything.